office in New York City. His talk is called, "For Such a Time as This, New York City Chief Forensic Dentist Remembers 9/11. Not only was 9/11 the worst attack that the U.S. experienced in a single day, it was also the largest victim identification undertaken in the U.S. on a scale no one ever imagined or anticipated. Dr. Jeffrey Burkes was the chief dental consultant to the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner of New York City, a native New Yorker and now a Bergen County resident who was responsible for mobilizing and supervising forensic dentists from the region and across the country to aid in the identification of victims. He will share with us his moving recollection of that day and the weeks that followed. Welcome.
Thank you, Liz. It's an honor sharing this podium with these first responders. We all have our story of 9/11, but my story is probably very unique. And when you asked me to speak, Amy, so many memories came back to mind. What I want to share with you is a very personal set of memories of that day 19 years ago. I'm a born and bred New Yorker and didn't move to New Jersey till my wife convinced me we should raise our toddler daughters in the suburbs. So in 2001, I was living in a small town with the crazy name of Burkes. I commuted to the city to my oral surgery office 5 days a week, and in addition to doing dentistry, I was the chief forensic dentist to the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner in Manhattan. Forensic dentistry is a pretty small specialty. If you like solving puzzles and crimes, it's fascinating. Across the U.S., there were maybe only 200 trained and practicing forensic dentists, and we are a pretty close community. We share stories of the interesting cases we have done and techniques we have used. The forensic dentist is called on when a victim cannot be identified by a visual ID or by fingerprints. In that case, the victim's teeth tell the story. Not only do they identify the person, but sometimes they lead to the perpetrator of a crime. What I'd like to tell you about tonight is what I saw on 9/11 in my role as chief forensic dentist. Then I want to tell you about some of the surprising good that came out of this tragedy as people banded together to help with this unimaginable task of identifying many hundreds of victims. Over the years, like some of you, I was very familiar with the World Trade Center. One of our dental societies would hold its installation of offices on the 107th floor of the North Tower at Windows on the World restaurant. Before we moved to Burkes, when my wife was a student at NYU on Trinity Place, right near the Trade Center, I would often pick her up in my car to save her the long subway ride home at night. I grew up in Lower Manhattan, and in 1993, I was called in to investigate the bombing of the World Trade Center parking garage by a group of terrorists. So when Lower Manhattan was attacked on 9/11, it was not only a professional matter, but also very personal to me. That morning at 8:50, I pulled up to my office on Fifth Avenue when my doorman said, "Look, Doc." He pointed south down Fifth Avenue to a thick ribbon of black smoke moving from west to east across the blue sky framed by skyscrapers. Moments later, Dave Schoenberg, the second in command at the medical examiner's office, Dr. Hirsch, Charles Hirsch, was the chief, called to tell me to report ASAP forthwith to the MD's office, down on East 30th Street. My job there, as I said before, was primarily to identify individuals by their dentition when visual ID was impossible. At that time, DNA was only beginning to be used for identification, and it took weeks to get a result. I've been chief forensic dentist there for over 30 years, and over the years we had assembled a skilled team who regularly practiced and drilled in order to prepare for a large-scale, multi-victim mass disaster, like an airplane crash at one of our airports. But we had never prepared for anything on the scale of 9/11. As I was pulling into the receiving dock at the Emmys office, the chief and 4 senior officers were just leaving to go down to the scene in a staff car. No one knew what to expect. There was no TV in the Emmys office, and everyone still thought a small plane had crashed into one of the towers. The chief rolled down his window, motioned for me to come over, and said, "You can get the next car." He had no idea that he was heading into the path of the first tower collapse, and that he would be injured when the building fell. In fact, all 4 men were injured. One suffered a serious brain injury and never returned to work. My friend told me days later that as they walked towards the incident command center, someone yelled, "Run!" And then he almost immediately was being pelted with increasingly larger and larger pellets. He dove under a parked van. You could hear the thumping against the roof, and in an instant it became totally black as the debris piled up all around. He felt he was being entombed and that no one would ever look for him under there. In the meantime, I had alerted my deputy forensic dentist to report. As I was gathering my supplies and we were about to leave, Dave put out his hand and with a look I had never seen before said, "Nobody's going anywhere." We had lost contact with the boss, the chief medical examiner. There were often dead zones in the city where radio contact was sometimes lost, so I wasn't that concerned that Dave had tried to raise him and the others and got no response. I listened to my police radio, which only made the situation more confusing. There were many maydays from fire and police asking for assistance, but no one was responding to them. I'd been an honorary fire and police surgeon for almost 25 years and was used to hearing maydays during a fire. But in the past, the response was so instantaneous, it was like it was orchestrated. You would hear, "Yes, Tommy, I see you. I'm right behind you." Or, "I got him, Chief." But this time, there was no response, just silence. Where was Rescue 1? Where was Rescue 2? I thought something was wrong with my radio, so I switched radio with the police officers standing next to me, but no change. So I went into the Officer Communication Center and I got a brand new radio. There still was nothing. Nobody was getting back to the Maydays. I just had this sick, empty feeling in my stomach that something was very, very wrong. The communication room monitored all radio communication between fire, police, EMS, even the towers at the airports. It was very confusing. We couldn't get any kind of a picture of what was happening. Finally, after what seemed like an hour, but was really only minutes, Dave told me that the New Jersey State Police had transported the boss and the others to a hospital in New Jersey. They were injured, but they would be okay. At that, Dave gave me the go-ahead. He said, "I have to stay here, but you go and report. And be careful, thanks." One of my deputies was a fire buff like me. He had installed a siren in his Crown Vic from an old fire truck that worked on compressed air. So with 3 deputies in tow, we hightailed it downtown. You could hear us coming from about a half a mile away. On the way downtown, I got a call from my wife in New Jersey, who was home watching everything unfold on TV. Susan knew a lot more than we did. She said that one of the World Trade Towers just fell. Well, when I responded to the 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center, I remembered that the tower we spoke of then was a TV antenna on the roof. I said, "So what? It's just a TV antenna." She said, "No, the whole building fell." I said, "You mean like a third collapsed?" She said that the whole building was down. I said, you mean like half? She kept saying the whole building was gone. I remember getting annoyed, since she obviously didn't know what she was talking about. I had responded to every building collapse in New York City for the past 30 years and never saw a total collapse. I was very anxious to get to the scene, so I just told her, I'll call you back later. When I arrived at Vesey and West Broadway, all I saw was a thick white cloud enveloping everything around us, and people jogging away from us and heading north. I got out of the car and looked up into the cloud where the middle of the North Tower should be. And for just an instant, I saw a flash of blue where the tower should have been. I asked myself, where did that come from? I didn't understand it. Remember, we still didn't know what had happened. There were fire hoses crisscrossing Vesey and small fires burning in the street, but no firefighters. We abandoned the car and walked to West Street, turned left, and kept going south. We passed 6 World Trade Center and stood directly across from 1 World Trade Center, which was the North Tower. What I saw in front of me was a wall of firefighters with their backs to me, standing in mass facing east. I could read their names: Kelly, Murphy, Walsh. I held my police inspector shield above my head and called out, "Medical examiner!" The wall of black turnout coats began to part like the Red Sea. In a moment, I was at the front, staring at a huge collapsed heap of building material and steel. By this time, my eyes were burning and tearing, so I said to myself, I'm going to look south, I'm going to clear my eyes and look back, and somebody better put that building back. But when I looked again, nothing had changed. Now anxiety switched to anger. I was mad. Who would do such a thing? Then I remembered why I was there. I switched back into professional mode. No time to feel angry, but had to get information to report to Dave. I stopped every fire chief and every white-shirted police officer on the scene, but all I got was conflicting information. I needed to know where the victims were. I heard, there's a temporary morgue up at Liberty Street. No, Doc, it's on Vesey Street. No, it's on Trinity Place. No, it's at the Marina, North Cove Yacht Harbor at Battery Park City. But I found nothing set up at any of those places, so I couldn't estimate the number of victims. I hadn't seen one body for identification. Looking at the high-end condos at Battery Park City, I saw flames leaping into the air from windows on different floors. But where were the firefighters? There were small fires to the left and right of me as I walked, but no one was attacking them. The firefighters were being drawn to that huge pile of rubble that had once been the World Trade Center. They were starting to dig with their bare hands to get to the men who were in those buildings minutes before. Convinced that there was nothing more for me to do there, I reported into the MB's office and went back. At this time, about 20 members of my team had arrived. I began to tell them what I'd seen, and when they asked me how bad it was, how many victims, I remember looking down and trying to estimate how many people could have been in those towers. As I was looking down, someone offered, "It's bad, Jeff. Real bad?" I said yes. Then we got down to the work of identifying remains. This is how it was done. Some of the team collected the most recent dental records from the victim's dentist. These are called ante-mortem records. Other team members searched through the remains looking for teeth or even a single tooth, so they could document and x-ray what they found. These were all unknown, and they were called post-mortem remains. Then, using a new computer program developed by a St. Louis forensic dentist, team members examined the post-mortem remains and entered the characteristics into the computer. The computer would then suggest possible matches between the post-mortem remains and the ante-mortem records. 2 forensic dentists compared the matches, and if they agreed, then a positive dental identification was declared, and the family was notified that the loved one had been found. We were very, very careful because the last thing we wanted to do was make a mistake. A mistaken ID would cause the family more suffering. All this took many months, with teams working 24/7 during the first 2 months. 450 dentists and hygienists had come to New York to help, and every one of them was needed. There was a scene, sadly repeated many times, I will never forget. When the remains of a member of service, fire, police, EMS, were brought from ground zero to be identified, the driver of the ambulance or fire truck would radio ahead and alert the commanding officer that they were bringing in a possible member of service. When that happened, we would hear a sound that meant we should stop work and report outside. Everyone would form a corridor of 2 rows, shoulder to shoulder, facing the opposite line, from First Avenue to the FDR Drive on 30th Street. As the vehicle turned the corner of First Avenue, there was complete stillness. People stood at attention. Then, an officer gave the command to salute. The vehicle stopped halfway down, and 2 New York City detectives came out of the building as an honor guard to escort the person's flag-draped remains inside. Suddenly, the noise and bustle of New York City and the hectic work inside the ME's office gave way to complete silence, like being in church. It felt that sacred. I said I also wanted to tell you about the good that came out of this tragedy. We saw the worst people could do, but then we saw shared grief bring out the best in people. You probably remember that people wanted to do something, anything, to help in any way they could. Over time, American flags appeared. It seemed they were everywhere. People showed up down along the West Side Highway where it looked like a war zone, handing out water bottles, fruit, and snacks to first responders who were coming off their shifts well into the night. Kids from across the U.S. filled brown lunch bags with treats and their drawings and notes of encouragement. They were left at the Salvation Army food wagon for the first responders. The outpouring of support from the forensic dental community was outstanding. My phone didn't stop ringing, and at home my wife was fielding emails from all over the country and from as far away as New Zealand, from forensic dentists eager to come to New York to help. Over the next month, those people closed their offices, left their families, and came to New York. My friends and colleagues from California were the first to respond. If you remember, for 2 days there were no flights at all in the U.S., and when the first few flights resumed, people were afraid to fly. But not the forensic dentists. They were on the first flight out of California and were scheduled to arrive at Newark at midnight. During the recovery effort, various police agencies rotated in protecting and serving at the medical examiner's office. That night, it was the New Jersey State Police. I asked the captain to bring in these dentists, friends of mine from the airport. He asked, "Lights and sirens?" Now, whenever I had the opportunity to use my lights and sirens, I never hesitated. So I said, "Of course." Well, he did more than lights and sirens. When the plane landed, the pilot announced to the passengers that there were some VIPs aboard, doctors who had come into New York to help with the identification. He said he would be stopping before the gate to let them off, and would everyone please remain seated. The plane stopped, and he asked for the dentist to come forward to the plane. As you can imagine, there was spontaneous applause. And my buddy, who was not shy and shared a dark sense of humor that you sometimes need in forensic work, said as he gave the Pope's wave as he walked forward, I met them at the ME's office and took them over to the NYU Medical School cafeteria for some food. At that time, some of the best restaurants in the city were sending food over, so this was no cafeteria food. I asked where one of the senior California dentists, Dr. Jerry Vail, was. Someone said, "Oh, he's behind us." After eating and explaining the work we had to do, I remembered that Jerry still hadn't come in, so I asked again. And someone said, "Oh, he's behind us. He doesn't fly, so he's driving from California." Jerry arrived 4 days later. I remember another California volunteer who sent his wife and kids to their planned Disney World for their vacation while he came to New York to help. He slept on a mattress on the floor of a vacant NYU dorm room. There were so many who came, but one in particular was Dr. Brian Hers from Oklahoma. He'd been the chief forensic dentist following the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995. He sent me a long email with wise advice on managing my life, professionally and emotionally, during a mass disaster of this magnitude. He, of all people, knew the toll it would take on my wife and daughters, my practice and health, and not just mine, but many others, especially the New York forensic dentists. Finally, Dr. Hurst counseled me, and I quote, "Take good care of those families waiting for news of their loved ones. They deserve the best we can do." Brian missed Thanksgiving with his own family that fall, but spent it with us in Ohokos. Eventually, my wife gathered up all the emails from the forensic dentist and created a scrapbook of all the personal items and newspaper articles that talked about our work at 9/11. One of those emails came in from Dr. Frank Stecky of Ontario, Canada. It is dated September 12, 2001, and it reads, "Jeff, sincerely hope you are well. My very sincerest and deepest sympathies to my American colleagues, and our prayers are with you. If there is any way we can help from the Canadian side, please, I am just a call away. I have had several calls between yesterday and today from other dentists willing to help. Rest assured that all Canadians are standing by our American cousins, shoulder to shoulder, however long resolving this incident takes. We now consider ourselves at war with you. God bless, and our prayers are with you and your team." I don't know if you know the story of Esther from the Bible, but this is a well-known quote where her uncle Mordecai says to her, "Who knows but that you have been brought here for such a time as this?" She found herself in an unlikely place, then realized that she was uniquely positioned to save her people from genocide. Well, as the many forensic dentists were coming into New York to do a job that was more massive than anyone could have prepared for, it occurred to me that they had been training as forensic dentists for such a time as this, never realizing that the skills and experiences of all of them would be needed at one time. I could talk for hours with remembrances, but I'll end with this one. One day in early October 2001, one of my deputies told me that the New York Historical Society was having an exhibit on 9/11, and that if you showed your 9/11 ID badge, you get in for free. I always like things that are free. So on that warm Saturday, on my way home, I stopped at the museum. It was interesting enough, and one exhibit was a large ledger book with what the information card said was the names of all the victims of 9/11. Now, before leaving the Emmy's office that day, I had confirmed the dental ID of a young man who worked at the World Trade Center, so his name was fresh in my mind. I thought I'd check to see if they got his name. Let's say it was John Smith. So I went over to the book. The book happened to be open to the S pages. It happened to be in the pages of Smith. And right in the middle of the page was the name John Smith. I didn't have to turn a single page to find him. I remember feeling surprised at the coincidence. But then I happened to look up on the wall, and there was a photo of my old friend Bill Feehan. He was the most senior member of the FDNY who was killed at 9/11. I got the feeling he was looking down at me and saying, "Go home, Jeff. There is nothing else to see here." And so I left.